Mapping the framework of flexibility, we have started what are the available flexibility sources. Of course, flexibility available sources are the generation or coming from the generation, dispatchable or variable generation, demand, and we have to distinguish between the different loads and of course electric mobility, the different type of storage and grid. And by grid meaning the flexibility technologies that may enhance the grid capacity and of course the interconnections. In the following position paper, we tried to have a first step on the quantification of flexibility needs because as Fabio mentioned, we have a potential unlocked, but we need some indices or some metrics to have a quantification of these needs. So if we can go to the next slide, we first tried to identify why flexibility needs will increase in the future. Of course, you may see here the different time scales and the available, let's say, a bundle of flexibility solutions. So still the time scales runs from the long term up to close to the real time. And the question why flexibility needs increase actually lie on the variability increases and uncertainty. And so flexibility actually is the ability of the system to cope with both variability and uncertainty and not jeopardizing the security of the supply of the system. So when discussing about variability, we do not only mean the variability of the load, as we know, or the generation, with more indicative the variability of the solar generation, but also about the uncertainty in every level, from RES, forecast error, up to network generation availability. So we foresee that flexibility needs increase due to variability and uncertainty in demand. Of course, the electrification of heating, transport, and other industry will have an effect in the pattern of the load, but also in generation and grid, since we have more power electronic dominance, so lack of inertia and less predictable flows. Of course, the available flexibility solutions actually can be divided in four big clusters from load, that means demand response or any other structure, in generation, in the network, and in storage. And of course, there is a mapping of the different potential to the different timeline. So after establishing a framework, what are the available flexibility sources? Why flexibility needs will increase? If we can go to the next slide, we see the outcome of our analysis. So what we propose here in our two papers is specific flexibility metrics in order to quantify and identify future flexibility gaps. So, of course, we have seen that there is a large scale of available flexibility needs, of course, depending on the timeline of investigations. So here we concentrated more in ramping flexibility metrics and scarcity period flexibility needs. So the first position paper, as you see on the left side of the slide, is about the assessment of future flexibility needs. It proposes metrics. These metrics comes after extensive discussion with the Dsos and also by sharing experience with the overseas system operators like ISO and other system operators in North America. And the second one is the scarcity period flexibility needs metrics, which actually focus on scarcity periods. And the most known example are windless winter weeks in the Northern Europe. So the position paper actually proposes specific flexibility metrics. Of course, these metrics are based on the adequacy results that TSO doing their adequacy and flexibility studies. And secondly, the report actually tests the metrics for specific countries which have an interest, like Germany due to the enhanced integration of renewable energy sources, or France or Belgium, actually tests and provides some examples of how these metrics can be used in order to pinpoint better in the future potential flexibility gaps. So, and one example for the rubbing flexibility needs metrics can be depicted in the next slide. So this is an outcome. This is a worst case scenarios we did in flexibility workshop a few months ago regarding Germany, how the flexibility needs in Germany will look like in 2030. Of course, is an extreme case scenario. And in this extreme case scenario, we actually calculated the 1 hour, 3 and 8 hour RABs. Of course, the rubbing issue was mentioned by Fabio, but here we deep dive and actually extended in other longer hourly ramps, which may impose some issues or some flexibility challenges. So the flexibility challenges in an hypothetical scenario for Germany in 2030 assumes an annual peak load of 100 gigawatt. And of course, there are ramps, 3 hours or 8 hour ramps, which needs to be covered by demand response, dispatchable generation, but what happens if the coal may be off by 2030, if the potential of hydropower plants may be less in the winter. So what we trying to do with this is just to pinpoint potential future flexibility gaps. And of course, these metrics can be fine-tuned and of course adapted to the energy mix of each country. So my last slide is the next one, which actually is some recommendations for flexible needs metrics and how this can be actually support the routing planning and regulatory and grid service programs procurement. So here what we have introduced is how you can quantify in the future specific flexibility gaps regarding ramping needs or scarcity flexibility needs by post-processing the adequacy simulation results, in which can be found in European resource adequacy assessment methods, which are run by the Dsos, and then determine if your products are sufficient to cover future flexibility gaps, and if not, then to see what steps you may need to include new flexibility services and products. And actually what we're trying to do here is to become proactive, because if there are some future potential flexibility gaps, then you have the time to prepare the discussions or stakeholder consultations regarding the potential new flexibility service and products you may need, and seek regulatory approval early enough so the gaps can be covered by procuring flexibility resources. Now, the procurement of flexibility resources is something that is going to be, I guess, discussion, and I think how this can be procured is the topic of the review of flexibility platform that comes next with Victor. So this is for me. I think I'm in time. Thank you very much, Fabio. The floor is yours.
Thank you. So I'm not sure if there are questions on Slido, but maybe we take them after, at the end of the session. I think would be best. So in that case, I would leave the floor to Victor for the flexibility platform.
Thank you, Fabio. So this presentation is to explain the findings of our reports that we have just finalized together with Frontier Economics. So it will be a joint presentation with Abbas Hussein and Matt Cooper, who are the lead of the project team. And it's been a month-long project, so really happy to show you this analysis that is very much factual about these platforms we see developing that pertain sometimes to more local flexibility to resolve constraints in distribution networks, but sometimes also more helping with like the balancing of the system. And why we've done that is like, I think Fabio mentioned it in the introduction, like TSO-DSO cooperation and in general also automated tools are really key if we want to harness the potential of distributed flexibility. And we see really platforms mushrooming now in Europe. It's almost difficult to keep track of them. And that has triggered quite a policy discussion and a lot of stakeholders' interest on if and what to regulate in that space. So actually, on this slide, you can see what we have done in ENTSO E, colleagues of mine, in early 2019. At the time, there was some discussion with Dsos Association, notably on the active system management report that was mentioned in introduction, which kind of, with other reports, lays the foundation for the ongoing policy debate on demand-side flexibility. And our intention was to complement this more top-down assessment of like discussion, the conceptual framework for harnessing the flexibility with more a bottom-up analysis of what's really happening on the ground. And this list of projects was to show really the reality of the role of DR resources in grid and system services, show also the role of TSO as facilitator, try to review the different use cases and come up with sort of taxonomy of models, see the potential market barriers, and eventually identify some best practices. And so we came up with the first catalog of 60 projects, both on national level, but also some Horizon 2020 projects. And that showed that there was clearly an evolution of the national balancing markets to enable DR participation. There was a lot of DSOs and third-party initiatives where really with a strong use case is local congestion management, but a lot of new concepts with maybe also some uncertain potential for the scalability. And so 2 years after, we decided to refresh that view because a lot of research projects that were identified before that actually no follow-up. There were new initiatives we have heard about. And also, of course, there was clean energy package that was adopted in the meantime, and that kind of introduced now the idea that also DSOs can really procure flexibility services for distribution network management. So, of course, there's a lot of regulatory sandboxing around that in each member state. So the next slides will show you what we have done now. We have asked Frontier Economics to do basically 3 things, like come up with a new database of platforms and categorize them into clusters. So there are 3 of them. There are more data exchange platforms, stricto sensu. There are flexibility platforms, and that will be the core of the presentation today, which really facilitate the procurement of grid and service services, and more aggregation platforms, so more focus onto the building of flexibility offers. Then in the second stage, we asked them to basically reach out to these different few selected platforms related to flexibility and develop a deep dive analysis. So we have 8 platforms. I won't introduce them. I will let Abbas and Matt do that. Just the criteria for selecting them was basically we wanted to focus on more platforms that are in implementation stage, or let's say close to, and that show a good diversity of functional and design characteristic of governance model, like sometimes led by TSO, sometimes led by DSO, sometimes together, sometimes it was third party, and to have also a fair geographical distribution. We have projects in the UK, in continental Europe, in the Nordics, in the Baltic. And so the outcome of this deep dive analysis is summarized in the report that I will now leave Matt and Abbas take you through.
Thanks, Victor. Hello, everyone. So, yeah, as Victor said, the focus of this presentation and the report is on flexibility platforms. And we've got a definition there, which is quite broad. So digital platforms that facilitate or support the provision of flexibility services to system operators from distributed energy resources. And now that leaves quite a lot of scope for variation in how these platforms operate. And we'll go into describe some of the key points of departure between the platforms we've reviewed. But fundamentally, the things that they all have in common is that they generate value by enabling an exchange from 2 sides of the market, and they reduce the transaction costs involved. And the reason why that's particularly important in today's power system is with increased decentralization, rather than having a small number of utility scale assets that are signing long-term contracts, We instead have a very diverse set of technologies and geographically situated market participants and information systems, and the transaction costs involved in exchanging all of the necessary data suddenly balloons, and this is where digitalization can play a real role. So within sort of that sort of common setup, there are lots of different use cases that flexibility platforms are providing. The platforms we're about to speak about focus typically on frequency response and congestion management, but there are distributed resources entering markets for voltage control in some pilots, and we also see peer-to-peer networks for wholesale energy trade. So I think one of the key points of departure that I mentioned is the operating models that we see, and there are three groups that we can categorize these platforms as. The first one is market intermediaries. So these are platforms that don't perform any of the core functions that a market does. So they don't form prices and they don't necessarily clear transactions, but they link to existing balancing and wholesale markets and some new congestion management markets to enable DERs to bid into these markets. The second category are marketplace platforms, and yeah, on the other side of that coin, it's those platforms that do perform in-house auctions and clear transactions within their own ecosystems. The last category is a bit of a special case. These are administrative coordination schemes, so platforms that assign redispatch based on cost-based and central allocations. So they don't use price signals or auctions. So in the next couple of slides, we'll walk through a few of those examples that we've gone into. Before we do, one of the tasks for the work we did was to characterize how these platforms play a role in the end-to-end procurement process for flexibility. And this sets out that end-to-end procurement process. But what's notable is that the platforms themselves don't necessarily perform the end-to-end process. They might focus on specific functions within that. The most obvious being that market intermediaries don't do price formation, but even within these categories, we see some marketplace platforms that defer certain steps of this process to the TSOs and the DSOs to handle in their own systems, or they leave it to the market operators to do. And I think that that's one of the other key variations that we see in the platforms that we've reviewed so far. So I'll now step through at quite a high level the platforms that we looked at. So starting with market intermediaries, the Equigi crowd balancing platform, which is a TSO platform, which it's set up to increase liquidity in TSO's balancing markets. And it does this by allowing aggregated flexibility through independent commercial aggregators to bid into the national balancing markets. And its key sort of value add here is the facilitating a secure data exchange that allows for validation of the product delivery, so the balancing service delivery, and supports near real-time bids, so in the AFRR standard. The second platform we did a deep dive in was Interface, which is a single portal for TSOs and DSOs to procure flexibility across wholesale and balancing markets. And this platform essentially puts the power exchanges in competition with each other and allows TSOs to access the broadest spectrum of flexibility. And the third platform we looked at here, which is also a TSO and DSO platform, is GoPax. GoPax is a portal that allows the system operators to issue a congestion notification, and then it connects to an associated intraday market. And it allows the participants in that market to submit bids that the TSOs and DSOs can use in GoPax to overcome that congestion event. That's probably the most advanced in terms of the amount of energy transacted to date, and that's in the Netherlands. So the next category of platforms we looked at was self-contained marketplaces, and we looked at Nodes, Piccolo, and Dsos Secre. So Nodes is set up originally by Nordpool. It's got 3 implementation projects in place at the moment in the UK, in Norway, and Stockholm. It has two novel features, which one being that it allows continuous real-time auctions. So flexibility providers submit bids continuously, and system operators submit requirements continuously, and the marketplace clears without ever being a direct interaction between the two. So it's a bit like a power exchange model, which is one of the unique features about the Nodes marketplace platform. Moving on to Piccolo. Now, Piccolo is also a self-contained marketplace that's used by UK-based DSOs. It differs to Nodes in that it is a closed auction, so there a flexibility provider submits its offers up into a point in time, at which point the competition is closed, and then Piccolo allows the DSOs to arrange the contract outside of the ecosystem of Piccolo. And lastly, Dsos Secre, which operates somewhere between a marketplace and an intermediary in that it connects to the day-ahead market, and this is in Spain, operated by Red Electrica. It connects to the day-ahead market and can cancel or reduce the wholesale energy transaction schedules in the market to avoid a congestion event. But if that event can't be solved in the day-ahead gate closure, the platform will accept congestion management bids in the intraday time, and will clear these bids from flexibility service providers in a pay-as-bid. And that gives a bit of an overview of the marketplace platforms. Lastly, Dara, which is our special case, which doesn't use market signals, but it creates a central redispatch of all participating units as part of the mandatory Redispatch 2.0 scheme, and it facilitates a joint optimization across all grid levels when it assigns flexibility based on the minimum cost to deal with that congestion event. So it's a data exchange platform that's operated in the Transnet control area at present, and facilitates mandatory redispatch. So I'll pass on at this stage to Abbas, who's going to talk about some of the policy issues that have come out from this study.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks also, Victor, for the introduction. Just before I get started on this topic itself, looking at a question that has been raised on Slido about what is meant by flexibility products, I think is a good one to maybe tackle before we go on to discuss, what we are really talking about. So, we are defining this in a fairly broad term. So it's basically the ability of any participant, whether it's generation or demand, to respond to a price signal. So this could basically be demand side response doing that, but also distributed generation, and increasingly more so into the future. It will be, things like solar PV, batteries installed in people's premises, but also a whole range of other technologies that can lower their or increase or decrease their consumption and or production in response to system needs and price signals reflecting those system needs. So just moving on to the challenges and open issues, it's maybe worth noting at the onset that this was not necessarily the focus of this particular engagement, but as regulation and policy nerds, we find it very hard to keep ourselves away from the broader context in which a lot of these flexibility platforms have been developing. And so I would say that it's important to note at the onset that the flexibility platforms that we have reviewed as part of the study appear to have evolved on the one hand in response to the immense challenge of facilitating provision of flexibility from very small scale participants distributed across low voltage networks. But on the other hand, they've also adapted to varying needs of both transmission and distribution system operators, as well as the relevant regulatory and institutional context in their jurisdictions. So once again, while this was not the focus of this particular study, we conclude our report, which I hope you'll have a chance to read, by setting out at a high level various policy challenges and issues that we envision will continue influencing the development of these local flexibility platforms as they evolve to help overcome these challenges in a range of different ways, some of which Matt referred to earlier. So thinking about what these challenges and open issues are, I would say that they broadly fall under 3 areas. First is improving market access for distributed energy resources. Now, this cannot be emphasized enough, and I would say that there are several aspects to it. Now, firstly, lower levels of monitoring of low voltage networks have meant that historically transmission system operators and even distribution system operators have had limited knowledge of flexible resources that are connected to these low voltage grids. And on the flip side of this, even flexibility providers continue to have limited sight of what grid constraints are in different regions, and consequently the flexibility needs in these different locations. And in addition, even if they are able to overcome the hurdles posed by minimum participation thresholds, given their small size through, say, like aggregation, these distributed energy resources continue to face disproportionately higher entry costs, given their relatively smaller sizes, and more generally weak participation incentives, either in the levels of revenue streams they are able to earn for providing these services, or indeed the reliability of these revenues going forward, given the typically short duration of local flexibility contracting. And a key challenge in this respect is sort of the limitations in the alignment of processes across different markets. And these would need to be addressed to ensure that these resources are able to stack revenues across the different markets, but doing so in a manner that does not create delivery or reliability risks in one market versus the other. So then there's a second category of challenges and open issues which pertain to DSO coordination. And I mean, it's worth noting there's quite a lot of improvements that have already happened in this regard, but still quite more that would need to be done to improve sharing of information between transmission and distribution system operators, particularly in this regard, for identifying and deploying these distributed energy resources for the provision of system services across all voltage levels. It's worth saying that DSOs have had decades of experience procuring flexibility. And on the flip side, distribution system operators understand the local context and situations on the lower voltage grids a lot better and may have more information on this. So there are hence synergies in improving coordination between them when you think about procuring flexibility from these distributed energy resources. But towards that end, there are several challenges that will need to be overcome. These pertain to sort of things like coordinated grid security analyses, or having sort of a more coordinated procurement process for flexibility. And what really lies at the heart of improving this coordination is the timely exchange of data and information between all system operators across different voltage levels. And there's quite a lot that improvements in data and digitalization that are broadly happening that can help towards that goal. So then there's a final category of challenges and open issues pertaining to the market design for these platforms. Now, as innovative flexibility marketplaces continue to take shape across Europe, there's something to be said around the alignment of market arrangements and product specifications, and the need for that is emerging in a sense at the moment. And a key aspect of this is going to be how local these platforms should remain when there are clear advantages for both system operators and flexibility providers for reasonably linking various local and national schemes, or indeed international flexibility platforms, like TER or MARI, for example. Now, this alignment can take many different forms. It can be, in the simplest sense, in how pre-qualification criteria are for example, set across different platforms, or it can, sort of go to the extent of trying to harmonize product requirements to try and make sure that the products become more fungible and hence can be exchanged a little bit more easily across wholesale, balancing, and flexibility markets. And I use the word harmonization here, given that there's a legitimate risk that very strict standardization of products or processes too early on can inhibit the opportunity for the market to innovate around the product designs that work best for a specific region and a specific local context. So yes, we discussed many of these issues in more detail, particularly in the context of how flexibility platforms are helping resolve some of these issues already. So, for example, in the case of improving the observability of and visibility of DER, many of these platforms are offering registries that allow flexibility providers to register or sort of indicate their interest for providing flexibility, and then similarly, system operators can indicate how much flexibility they need in what location on these registers that provide for sort of an indication of the amount of revenues that flexibility providers can earn in certain location, and indeed the need for that flexibility in a particular location into the future. There are then several other examples of how, say, things like DSO coordination is being facilitated, or the range of different types of standardization that we have, or harmonization that we've seen starting to emerge in the flexibility products across. So I hope that you enjoy reading our report, and please do reach out if you have any thoughts or comments, and happy to, of course, take more questions now as well.
Thank you, Abbas. Thank you, Matt. So there are actually a few questions on the slide, though, that are directed to you. We start with one very concrete. So as the reports also included platforms enabling local energy trading separately or along with flexibility?
Sure, happy to pick that up. So I understand the question is about peer-to-peer wholesale trading, and yeah, the project itself surveyed a range of platforms, including some peer-to-peer. An example being the local energy market in Cornwall, which has recently just been procured, I think, by EPEC-Spot. So yeah, we did review, but that's not the focus of the report. The focus of the report is for platforms that provide system services. So not so much wholesale.
Thank you. There are also a couple of questions related to the regulatory challenges and to what extent there should be some regulatory action at European level to design some common rules for the platform's development. Well, of course, I think Abbas mentioned that actually maybe some too early actions in that respect could prevent some further innovation. It's actually on ENTSO E position to rather not see a new network code touching on this, but rather maybe adapt also our existing codes and guidelines in this respect to make sure DR participation can be facilitated. But perhaps may I also, if you want to address this point and maybe show among the three models you identified in the report, maybe which one is perhaps the most stable, the most promising, or most mature?
It might be worth saying at the onset that, I mean, I guess it's hard to sort of pick winners or losers at this stage, at least, because it's at least insofar as the report was trying to capture how these challenges are being addressed by the different platforms. And so I wouldn't necessarily say that we have arrived at a conclusion in relation to what is the preferred sort of solution. But then there are different ways in which some of these things are being addressed. So I think so one question that I see being raised is in relation to market monitoring to check for market abuse and sort of how efficiently the market is operating. This is definitely a relevant issue, particularly for platforms that have a very local orientation, because given one of the issues with a platform that's very much focused on a specific region is that it could be more likely that the number of the participants who are bidding in these platforms to provide flexibility are either consolidated under one entity, and this will the risk of this will increase as aggregators continue to play the role that they are playing. Or indeed, they can be basically one or two entities that all that provide for more opportunity for collusion around say pricing. And there are already different ways in which these things are being monitored in the form of like the either I suppose the platforms which are marketplaces in their own right, it's perhaps more pertinent for them because market intermediaries, by virtue of linking to wholesale markets, would in a sense rely on these monitoring processes within the wholesale markets to actually identify these types of abuses. But that being said, there are things that have been done and that can continue to be done in sort of in pre-qualification criteria or in sort of the settlement processes, looking ex post at who is being awarded what and at what price, for example, that can go a long way towards addressing these concerns. Matt, do you want to add anything more on that?
No, I think that covers the question on market monitoring and increased decreased gaming, which is a big topic, particularly in local flexibility markets. But yes, we're sort of not wading too far into recommendations for which model is the most appropriate. I think that there are merits to local markets and merits to intermediaries that join to national. And I guess we'll see over the next couple of years which way the tide turns.
Thank you very much, Abbas and Matt. Time is a bit running, and we have a next speaker now. So I would propose that maybe we take some of the questions in written on Slido. Matt and Abbas, if you would like to maybe react also in written to those, and I'm sure there are also some others that would be addressed by the panel debate after the coffee break. So thanks again very much, and let's now move on to the next presentation. Will be handled by Paul de Wit. Paul is working for Alliander. He's been longly involved in notably TSO DSO cooperation at the open level, and you come here also with a new hat, I would say, as an interim member of the new expert group of the EU Dso entity related to distributed flexibility. So very happy to have you, and Paul, the floor is yours now.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm trying to recover from a cold, so my voice is a little bit low, and I hope you can still hear and understand me. First of all, thank you very much for inviting the EU Dso entity. Will you show the slides, Victor, or?
Yes, just a couple of seconds.
Okay. So, and thank you very much for this interesting webinar. I think especially the invitation underlines the necessity to cooperate between DSOs and TSOs, especially on the topic of flexibility market design. So the presentation is about the DSO role and flexibility needs. My name is Paul de Wit. I work for Alliander, and I'm representing here the EU Dso entity. I think it's one of the first presentations of the EU DSO entity. So I'm really honored to be doing this. Could you please show the next slide? The EU DSO entity, it's more or less the new kid on the block, I would say. It's first a small introduction of the EU DSO entity. Its origin is in the Clean Energy Package. It's the Regulation 943. We started already this year, and at the moment we have more than 900 DSOs are a member, and connecting more than 260 million customers in Europe. So it's already a huge number. But of course, the sizes of the different DSOs are very much different, especially if you compare that to TSO members. The EU DSO entity is an expert entity, providing expertise on, of course, DSO-TSO cooperation. It's very important topic for the EU DSO entity. Network codes and guidelines, facilitating flexibility and user access to markets, facilitating the integration of renewable energy resources, but also digitalization, data management, and certainly last but not least, cybersecurity. The whole EU DSO entity reflects the new role of DSOs, more or less a little bit on an equal footing with ENTSO E, you could say. It's of course it's a forum of expertise, and it's a contact point for the EU Commission for technical matters for European DSOs. If you could please, next slide. The flexibility is key to a successful energy transition. Of course, it's a of course, we have increasing volumes of especially distributed energy resources connected to the distribution systems. It's a challenge on the one side, but also it can also be a solution on the other side. But it is for sure, and I think we already saw that earlier this morning, it's quite for sure that we will get much more of the renewable energy resources. Especially for the Fit for 55 initiative from the Commission, from fossil to renewable, but also if you look at from a centralized to a decentralized system, the system is changing a lot. We are getting much more decentralized production, of course. But also the digitalization is very much important. If you could please show the next slide. Especially on the distribution grid, we face an increasing number of distributed congestions. Of course, high volatile RES, but also on the new loads like electrical vehicles, heat pumps, and which can create grid constraints or distribution congestions. So, and this is an example of the Netherlands, which is quite problematic at the moment. This is only production congestion. We also have congestions in consumption, but this is the production, and red means that no new connection for production can be accommodated. Orange is under investigation, and yellow means it possible congestion. So you can see we face a lot of congestions at the moment in the Netherlands. If you please show our next slide. Changing and enhancing the role of DSOs. In the past, more or less, we had the fit and forget approach. Plan and build new grids, connect new customers, operate the grid. And but at the moment, it's much more about also providing system stability services, but also we see totally new connections like EV charging points, heat pumps, and so on and so on. So there's really a necessity to unlock the flexibility, but also the digitalization is very much smart metering and data management is becoming more and more important. So as a neutral market facilitator, DSOs are undertaking new tasks aiming at unleashing the potential of flexibility into the grid, especially unleashing the potential of flexibility is quite a challenging task, and we saw also the review of the flexibility platform report, which shows that already some initiatives are being taken, and probably more in the future will come. But if you please go to the next slide. Flexibility needs for DSOs. First step, what is flexibility? Modification of generation, injection, and or consumption patterns. Can be individual or aggregated in order to provide a service within the energy system or grid stability. It can be either for market parties or for DSOs, but for system operators, it's mainly of course, for grid stability. For which purposes? Mainly for congestion and power quality problems. Congestion I already mentioned a lot, but also voltage problems are rising and can be solved with flexibility. Could also serve as an alternative to network reinforcement when it's more cost efficient than traditional reinforcement of the network. It's very important that especially on the distribution grid, it can be short or longer term agreements, and especially the longer term agreements can be very much applicable on distribution grids, because then you have more certainty, especially if you only have a short term, like a bid ladder, that raises problems like if there's enough liquidity, and especially long-term contracts can help solving that problem. So which flexibility services? The services, local congestion management, non-frequency auxiliary services, voltage control, or grid capacity management. But apart from DSOs, also other parties can activate the same flexibility. It can be market parties in reaction to market prices or balancing purposes. It can be TSOs, it can be energy communities, and can be active customers. And that whole range of parties can cause all kinds of challenges in the grid which need to be coped with. And so if we look on the market design, please next slide. What do we think is important for the market design for this? This is our position mainly based on the joint roadmap we did together also with ENTSO E, together with the EU DSO associations. It's a joint roadmap on demands, flexibility, which was done beginning of this year. A lot of these topics also mentioned in the previous presentation about the review of flexibility platforms. Product design is very much important. It's essential task to enable wide participation of actors, which is very much important for the product design. Market access, such as transparency, but also very important is the market processes and T&D, TSO, DSO coordination. And that's still something that needs to be figured out between TSOs and DSOs. Coordination between TSO and DSO is required to avoid harmful interference in each other's grids. And that's very much important, and that's a task that where ENTSO E and the EU Dso Entity can help each other together find solutions for this, or maybe collect best practices. Also, an important part of the market design is the measurement and validation and settlement. The verification is also a very big or important part of the market design. If you please go to the next slide, the product design. First of all, for the product design, aggregation, especially on the distribution grids, aggregation is very much important. Smaller units must be able to participate in an aggregated form. And if we look at the products, we think that it's not really needed to have a European harmonization of the products, but what could be very helpful is a common non-exhaustive EU-defined list of attributes which can be used in the different member states. Then also on this topic we speak more or less a little bit the same language, which make it much easier for parties to create services in different countries. Product standardization must be limited to keep flexibility products open to innovation and future development. As mentioned also in the previous presentation, we are more or less at the beginning of the unlocking of flexibility. Therefore, if you now if you now have too much standardization, there's not much room for new innovations. So the standardization should be as limited to keep flexibility open to innovation. That's for the product design. If we look at market access, of course, data exchange or electronic interfaces are very much important, are very important, of course, especially if you look at the aggregation, then electronic interfaces and especially on the scale for distribution grid, you cannot do that on the phone or by email. It has to be done by electronic data exchange. So that's very much important. Value stacking is also very much important. But also value stacking should be possible. However, you should also avoid double payments, paying twice for the same product, for the same delivery, and also trying to avoid gaming, of course. Flexibility resource register, it's mentioned in the ASM report that we did together with ENTSO E in 2019. The flexibility register can help in for the grid pre-qualification, but also product pre-qualification, especially for the pre-qualification processes. The flexibility resource register can be very helpful. It can collect all the significant data information about resource assets and their capabilities, and that could help also for the product qualification, which unit can supply which services, but also the grid pre-qualification. Where is it located in the grid? And the grid pre-qualification, it could be either static or dynamic, but the aim here is that both TSOs and DSOs can view which flexibility resources are available in a certain area. And that's very much a benefit for the flexibility resource register. If you please go to the next slide. One of the most important parts, I guess, is the market is the DSO-TSO coordination. Of course, here also electronic data interchanges is vital and key. But for DSOs, we see it very much necessary to be able to oblige larger DSO connected users in a congested area to provide the necessary data, even for the users who are not considered to be a significant grid user on a transmission level, without putting extra burdens on all SDUs. So in specific areas, we think it can be very helpful if we can oblige to users to provide more information, especially in the congested areas. Coordination for security. Each system operator is responsible for redispatch actions in his own grid. I think we think that's very much important, of course, but also European IT. I think I was muted, but hopefully it works again.
No, you're back. You're back here.
Okay. Yeah. IT standards for coordination for security should be developed. This can help monitoring the security, monitoring equipments or monitoring connections. A harmonized role model could be helpful. This is to create a common language, and it should be could be possible for the Eu Dso Entity together with ENTSO E to further develop this. And of course, the flexibility resource register can also help very much for T&D coordination. It's helpful to know which resources are available. The exchange of information around flexibility resource register concept could be it could be also part of the regulation. So if you please go to the next slide. Measurement and validation. The last part, of course, we can mention much more for the market design to enhance distributed flexibility, but these are the topics that we selected from the roadmap. Smart meter data exchange, validation, validated historical measurements from main meters must be available to different stakeholders. That's very helpful, of course, also for flexibility service providers to be able to have easy access to metering data, but also near real-time data, if that's available, should be can be very helpful. Also from the main meters, especially if you look at congestion, then the services provided should be, of course, to the grid. Therefore, the main meter is more or less the main topic, the main resource, whether or not a service is being delivered. It's the basis for the settlement and the observability processes, and that's very much important for us. So, and this data is increasingly available, but rules need to be needed for how to use it in these processes, at least in terms of customer consent and validation. Of course, customer consent and validation is very much important here. Baselining. Baselining is more or less the plan, which was original planned, and the difference between what is measured and the baseline is what has been delivered. So the definition of baselining is very much important. we think it's best being defined on a member state level, in agreement with FSBs and system operators. And there's an advice to the EU DSO entity and the ENTSO E to collect a list of best practices of baseline methodologies, as such, it means that it might be sufficient if only general requirements for such cooperation is established in a network code, but not in details, because it's still in an early stage. The list of best practices could include baseline methods, associated algorithms, etc., but also a planning could be a baseline. So this is more or less the presentation. I hope I'm still on time. Thank you very much for the attention.
Many thanks, Paul. So there are a few questions in the chat if you have the time for that.
Yeah.
Notably, you mentioned that if you perhaps mute yourself, a bit of echo. I mute you and I will unmute you for the answer. Sorry about that. So you mentioned in your presentation that there are almost 900 members now to the Eu Dso Entity. It's a huge number. Congratulations. And of course, there were questions in the chat that maybe the level of readiness for each of these DSO might be different when it comes to developing active system management of the distribution grid, which leads me to a question on maybe on the DSO coordination. Is it something that how can you see that developing for facilitating maybe a more active management of distribution networks? Which role will it play? Sorry, I'm just need to unmute you. Marco, can you unmute the Paul, please?
I can also unmute myself.
Perfect. Yeah, great. Thanks.
So the question is, how could T&D coordination develop and be done? I think that's the question.
DSO.
Right? DSO, yeah. Well, in your review of flexibility platforms, one of the platform you reviewed was the GoPax platform, which is the, at least that's in the Netherlands. That platform is especially created for T&D coordination. It interacts with different systems, like the Apex system, like the with the market systems. They interact with the different market systems, and then all the bits are being collected, and it's checked whether or not it can be executed. This is one way maybe of solving it, but yeah, we think it's a good approach, and that is especially created for T&D coordination. And well, to be really honest, I think it's a good example for although I'm from the Netherlands, but yeah, it's one of the examples that you could look at.
Thank you, Paul. And of course, a lot of member states are now busy also with the implementation of clean energy package, which gives also a more important role to the DSOs. Do you have some hints as regards to which member states is perhaps the most advanced in enabling DSOs to take a more active stance?
I think to be really honest, I think most of the initiatives are still coming from the DSOs and TSOs themselves. I do think that legislation is not yet very much in place in the different member states. Most of the initiatives, as of course, as you see in the flexibility platform, the review of flexibility platform is not coming from regulation or from NRAs or member states, but it's more own initiatives. I'm not 100% sure about the UK, but and of course the UK is very much involved in this, in flexibility, the Piccolo and Western Power Digital, but also France and also Germany. But I think it's not so much about member states or NRAs with legislation, but it's more own initiatives from TSOs and DSOs, I guess.
Thanks a lot. All right, we just 4 minutes
Sorry.
late a little bit. No worries. The timing is also due to the other presenters, so not all the blame. So I propose we call it for coffee break now. Thank you very much, Paul, for this presentation. It was really a pleasure. And we will resume at 11:30 with a new presentation and a panel debate. Thank you very much, and see you very shortly.
Thank you very much.
Just quickly checking if audio and video is fine. If anyone's in the room still, it would be great if you confirm you can see the slides and you can hear and see me well.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Yes.
Super. So please go back to coffee. Thank you so much.
Welcome back, everyone. So it's 11:30 now. I see Leon already ready to present his slides. So after the first session where we looked at the flexibility needs by GSOs and DSOs and how flexibility platforms can facilitate the provision of such flexibility to system operators, we now deep dive into a specific and a bit more technical topic. So we look at market-based redispatch, the opportunities, but also the challenges. And we start with the Professor Dr. Leon Earth, and he's a founder and director of Neon, a boutique energy economics consulting firm, and he's also assistant professor at the ERGE School, a Berlin-based public policy school. He's an energy economist and expert in electricity market design, and Leon has advised German's government on market-based redispatch in multiple projects, and he currently supports Elia Group on Dispatch Hubs project. He has also published a widely cited academic paper on inkjet gaming. Thank you for joining us, Leon. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Very much like to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation, and looking forward to a discussion that's constructive and forward-looking. What I'm going to present is heavily informed by a 2-year research project that we did on behalf of the German government that led to a series of publications that are also linked on the slides, which will be distributed. I do want to point out that this was teamwork, and in particular, Ingmar Schlecht, my colleague, and Christoph Maurer and Bernd Testegen from Consentec were instrumental and heavily involved in this work. This is the link to the paper that was just mentioned in case people want to look at the long version of this talk. So where we are is a situation where European wholesale electricity markets are organized in bidding zones such that price spreads may exist within zones, not within zones, but between. As a consequence, internal grid congestion is obviously solved separately from wholesale markets through out-of-the-market redispatch mostly. In countries such as Germany, redispatch is mandatory. Participation is mandatory for many market participants, and compensation is based on cost and foregone profit. In this setup, it's very difficult to integrate loads into this redispatch, because essentially the regulator would need to know the individual willingness to pay for electricity in every moment in time for every consumer of electricity, which is practically impossible. Hence the idea of voluntary markets for redispatch. The idea is that system operators would buy upward or downward redispatch. Anyone can participate voluntarily, and compensation is somehow based on bids when being activated. So I'm talking about a redispatch market where activation is remunerated. Because of the nature of Kirchhoff's law and load flow, these markets must be at or near nodal granularity in terms of spatial resolution. These proposals come by different names. We call them flexibility markets, smart markets, market-based redispatch, redispatch markets, or other names. Loosely speaking, I'll talk about all these. The hope is, of course, that such markets would incentivize consumers and decentralized assets to participate, turn networks into smart grids, coordinate everything from heating to batteries, thereby help avoid expensive and complicated grid expansion, at least to some degree, and ultimately save the zonal European wholesale market design. There's two fundamental and essential problems that we've identified in our project. The first one is pretty obvious, and it's locational market power. Given the high granularity, some generators and loads are much more effective at solving any congestion than all others. And that has the usual consequences of market power. Generators tend to inflate prices at the cost of ratepayers to earn higher profits. In this context, maybe it's worthwhile to think about mandatory redispatch with cost compensation essentially as a way of mitigating market power. And I would say a pretty smart way, by the way. But I don't want to talk about market power today. I want to talk about the second issue, inkjet gaming or strategic bidding. This is repercussions that the zonal electricity market faces when a nodal redispatch market is introduced. And this is different from exercising market power. However, these two phenomena may be mutually enforcing. I will focus on this in the next 10 minutes. So essentially, when we talk about ink deck gaming, this is what happens. We think about a two-stage market where we have a first stage zonal spot market and a second stage locational redispatch market. So think about a generator in an oversupplied region, such as northern Germany. Those generators will anticipate they will be paid for ramping down, but they can only be paid if they are available. That means if they can be ramped down, that means if they are producing. So they bid on the spot market below their variable cost to be eligible for downward redispatch. Vice versa, in the south of Germany, in a scarcity region where electricity is scarce, generators will anticipate they will be paid for ramping up, but only if they are available for ramping up. That means if they are not producing anyway, that means they will bid above variable cost, they will overbid and withhold capacity from the spot market, if you want to say so. In other words, generators have an incentive for strategic bidding, and that creates a number of pretty problematic consequences. Let me talk you through the details in a bit, and we will use a simple graphical model to this. Think about the box to the left of Germany or any other geography that has a similar pattern, where in the north we have generation, in the south we have consumption, and we have some generation, and there is a connection that's limited in capacity. The supply and demand curve of the single hour we look at, you find to the right. And what happens on the spot market is, of course, that the illusion of the copper plate applies. There is no grid constraints. The market price is clears where demand and supply of the zone meet, which in our example is 50 euros per megawatt hour. The problem is implicit in this clearance is a line flow of 40 gigawatts, which is impossible if the line only can carry 30 gigawatts. So what happens in a regulatory redispatch regime is that system operators select plans to ramp down and select plans to ramp up. And we assume here they know the right plans to ramp up and ramp down. They pick the most efficient and most cost-effective plans to do so, and compensate those on a unit-by-unit basis for the cost incurred and the profit foregone. So let's move to the interesting part. What about market-based redispatch? In market-based redispatch, the crucial point is that the zonal clearing will look different. Why is that the case? Well, this is the case because generators in the south, and I would like to focus you on the green line here, generators in the south anticipate they can earn more money if they sell electricity at the second stage redispatch market. They can earn 60 euros per megawatt hour, and they would be able to earn only 50 on the spot market. So what do you do if you have the choice between earning 60 and 50? Well, you go for 60. That means they overbid on the spot markets. And a similar phenomenon occurs with the peaking plants located in the north of the country. They underbid on the spot market. They push themselves into the market in order to be able to ramp down in the second stage. And that leads to kind of ironically to a situation where the load flow is increased at the spot market stage. So instead of 40 gigawatts, now we have 45 gigawatts that would like to be traded. And instead of having a line congestion worth 10 gigawatts, we have 15 gigawatts overload. And as a consequence, these plants will bid on the redispatch market, the second stage, and they will earn money. And the clearing prices in this example that you see in front of you are 60 and 30 respectively in the south and in the north. So what are the consequences of such gaming? First of all, and I've mentioned this, systematically congestion is made worse. So we're going to see higher redispatch volume. We're going to see more congestion. You may want to call this virtual congestion on the spot market, but these are redispatch volumes that someone needs to take care of. We also see windfall profits. Profits of generators increase and consumers pay more, in particular through grid fees, because someone has to pay for redispatch, of course. This also is problematic for financial markets and hedging. Financial zonal markets do not provide a good hedge, essentially because the redispatch market revenues become the most relevant source. This is similar to normal pricing markets in the US, where you need someone to pay for or cover the basis risk. And all this creates additionally perverse investment incentives. So it provides us an incentive to build ghost plants in the oversupplied region, building new peakers in northern Germany that never actually are used to produce electricity. They are only built to game the market, to pretend to be producing in order to be ramped downwards. Our clear conclusion is installing two market stages with different locational granularity will produce inconsistent results. You're going to see feedback effects and repercussions. In particular, it's important to realize from the very beginning on that the spot market, the zonal market, will not be independent from the ladder redispatch market. Any analysis that assumes this, I think, is pretty flawed. You can think of ink deck gaming as arbitrage trading. Arbitrage maybe is not the precise word because some risk is involved, but think of this as loosely as arbitrage trading, where market parties exploit the arbitrage between two different markets, the zonal versus the locational market. And in one way, you can think about them buying cheap and selling expensive, either first buying and then selling, or first selling and then buying. However, unlike in other arbitrage cases, this kind of arbitrage trade does not make prices converge, essentially because every megawatt hour of arbitrage trade will also increase the demand for redispatch by the same megawatt. So it's a kind of a self-fulfilling or self-sustaining arbitrage trade. What do you need to do this? You don't need market power. You don't need any ability to influence the price. You don't need to be a big player, and you don't need to collude with anything, with any of your competitors. In turn, fostering competition will not make ink deck gaming disappear. And ink deck gaming, in our view, is not a violation of competition law or balancing responsibilities. What you do need to play that game is have some foresight about congestion. So you need to be able to predict at least roughly when congestion will occur. In countries with a structural congestion and predictable congestion, which now I think includes most European countries, I would argue that's relatively easily possible. And remember that each activation of your own asset is another opportunity to learn. So even if you don't know anything about the others, you always will learn something about yourself, and that's 8,760 times per year in learning opportunity. This, what I've sketched out here, concerns all markets of what we call extra markets, additional markets on top of this, the spot market. It affects pay-as-bid pricing as much as marginal pricing. Loads can do the same thing. It's not only generators. And of course, that doesn't only happen in transmission grids. Distribution grids actually could be even worse because they are more predictable and less meshed. Here's a list of papers who looked into this issue. And if you don't want to read academic papers, you can also open Netflix tonight and watch the documentary about Enron. And this quote here actually refers to ink deck gaming, where one actor says, describes what they do by saying they make money in essence for doing nothing. So ink deck gaming even got its Netflix series. In this debate about ink deck gaming, which has been going on for a couple of years, there's a lot of empirical statements, often based on not rigorous methods. So people told me, look at the UK, it's working fine, or look at Sweden, it's working fine. And the working fine statement really comes from the observation that nothing is happening, but happening really has never been defined. Now, luckily, last year, there was one empirical paper published as a working paper that's really worthwhile looking, and I recommend everyone here in the room to have a look in case you're interested. It's published by a team of authors from Stanford. They looked at Italy, and they find, with using very good methods and appropriate data, very, very robust and clear evidence for ink deck gaming taking place. So this is not a ghost. This is not a theoretical academic abstract phenomena. This is something that happens on the electricity market every day, and it's problematic. How can we get rid of this? It's very difficult. And we don't think there's a good way to mitigate this. Various regulatory strategies have been proposed: decrease transparency, but we want to have transparency; increase competition, but competition is not a solution; regulate bids, but if we could regulate bids, then we would have the information that we need to do cost-based in the first place. So we can't regulate bids in that way, and activating bids randomly, but such random activation has true welfare costs. So in a word, market monitoring is much easier said than being done as far as ink deck gaming is concerned. But there's an even more fundamental reason why mitigating this is kind of a strange idea, because firms don't violate the incentives they face. They really behave according to the incentives. So ink deck gaming is perfectly rational for firms facing the incentives they face. And to an economist like me, it's kind of awkward to think about first installing incentives, then firms act according to these incentives, and then you punish them for doing so. So very fundamentally, I think that's pretty hard to justify because it always will imply discriminating between generators who are out of the money and who are in the money. And one of them would be being taken away the locational rent, while the other one can keep it. I'm running out of time, so let me conclude. Market-based redispatch is likely to have severe side effects. If congestion is predicted, here's some numbers that our colleagues in Aachen have done calculated for that study. They find a redispatch volume increase due to in-deck gaming that's 2 to 6-fold and a tripling of costs. Mitigation strategies are pretty difficult to find, essentially because redispatch markets fundamentally reward behavior by actors that puts the transmission grid under stress. And if we know anything about electricity market design, it is that never, never, never you should systematically reward behavior of actors that stresses the system. However, clearly this is a trade-off. So market-based redispatch has benefits. You can attract loads, and it has problems, economic costs, market power, and gaming. So I want to be very clear, if you want to stick to cost-based mandatory redispatch, it's very, very difficult to integrate consumers in a meaningful way in the setup. Nevertheless, we conclude that here the danger is bigger than the chance, and we would recommend refraining from activation-based redispatch markets. So what can we do instead? Well, there's of course the big long-term solution of locational marginal pricing. I don't want to talk much about this because it's a long-term option. Certainly, it has its own problems, and it most likely is only an option for the transmission grid and not the distribution grid. Another route would be to attract consumers to redispatch in voluntary contracts, but not in a short-term energy way of remuneration, but in longer-term capacity contracts. We've looked into this. I can't talk too much about this due to time. Bottom line is, we think that might be an option, but also this is not a silver bullet. This is not easy, and many tricky design questions remain unsolved. Another alternative, and that's maybe the third big alternative route, is to provide other locational incentives to consumers and producers to steer generation, storage, and consumers to the right location in the grid and make them operate the right way. And that includes everything from deep connection charges, locational grid usage charges, support schemes that have some geographical elements. And all these incentives in general do not incentivize gaming, but we all know they have their own problems. What's my thinking here is that time variant and location specific distribution grid fees is probably something we cannot avoid if we really want to electrify transport and heating. So we need something like this. However, I do want to flag that those signals will never be based on the real-time demand, supply, and grid conditions. So they will always be approximations given the day of the time of the day and the day of the week and so on, how the grid behaves on average. So they are not a first best economic solution, but I think it's pretty clear we are not talking about first best here. We need to find something that's pragmatic and that works despite the problems. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to you, Leon, for this impressive insight and very clear conclusions. I'm sure we'll get back to some of the statements in the panel discussion. I also see questions coming in via Slido, but I suggest we take these questions after we hear the second speaker of this session. So I'd like to introduce Jürgen Björndalen. Jürgen is an economist. He works for DNV since 2017, and he's been with the electricity sector in various research projects since the late 80s. His experience includes working with power producers, TSOs, DSOs, industrial electricity end users, and national and international regulatory authorities on a broad set of topics, primarily related to market design. He was part of the market design team for nodes and has a passion for market-based solution. Thank you for joining us, Jorgen. The floor is yours.
So thank you, Marco, and thank you for this opportunity to share some thoughts. It's definitely not the first time and for sure not the last opportunity to discuss flexibility and market design, because these are, as Leon elegantly pointed out, real problems. So I guess I'm here mostly because of this report we did for Nodes 1 year ago. I have outlined sort of briefly the points I will try to raise. Is it a problem? Why we need markets? And what are the mitigating measures? And for some of us, the famous old Norwegian example to the end. So definitely there are problems. In particular, if, as Leon pointed out, if you have a second market to resolve constraints that are ignored in the first market, then that's basically an invitation to position yourself such that you will be rewarded in the second market for solving the problem you have created yourself in the first market. It's a well-known problem here in Norway. We have had it at least for 30 years, and it has its own name, as I will come back to. Now, the second thing is that we are witnessing increasing congestions, not only in transmission at the transmission level, but also at distribution level. And electrification implies that demand is increasing fast on all voltage levels. As technology for congestion management is now affordable also below transmission level, it is reasonable to assume that we will face quite a lot of congestion issues also at the lower voltage levels. While distributed generation is of course increasing, we find typically the cheapest flexible resources at the demand side in terms of load shifting in combination with heat or storage, electricity storage, for instance. And these options, they have quite different cost structures than those typically participating and competing at the transmission level. So the issue is not really, or not only whether or not to apply market mechanisms, but to some extent also to what, how far we can develop non-wire alternatives to traditional grid reinforcement or use non-wire alternatives while waiting for grid reinforcement to happen. It should be, we should sort of think a little bit about what this gaming activity is, because it's not really a risk-free activity. And the risk depends, among other things, on which resources are participating, in particular in the second market. So I think, first of all, if bidding with no intention to deliver is not a crime, it should be regulated such that it is. I'm no legal expert, but I hear strong arguments that this is already a remit violation, and I guess other people can comment better than me. Second, if the supply curve for flexibility is relatively flat, the potential reward is relatively low as well, because if you hold back production in phase 1 only to deliver more in phase 2, and you have competitors in the second phase that have lower offers than you, then your potential reward is much lower. And then there is actually a risk for not being able to deliver in the second market as well, or being forced to deliver in contradiction with your own costs. And then third, as pointed out, you need some ability to forecast the demand for redispatch in order to do this with a profit. If you cannot forecast it, which is perhaps a more common phenomenon if you look at lower voltage levels, gaming is certainly not, or not always, the first best option for market participants. So to me, the question is partly, do we need market-based redispatch? Yes, I think we do, because congestions are not only unavoidable, but they are beneficial. Perhaps grid expansion isn't super costly. Typically, low voltage network are relatively cheap, but it takes time. And while waiting for sufficient capacity, at least, we need some sort of non-wire alternatives. And secondly, the cost functions for production are, while these are well known, the costs for load shifting that's virtually not transparent at all. So sort of regulating demand side participation in the same way as we can do with the traditional generation technologies is not really a useful route to in any case. And there are, as we have seen, there are mitigating measures. Long-term contracts are conceivable with aggregators or large consumers. These contracts can indeed regulate how the prices for participation in a redispatch market or redispatch solution should look like. Then we are, of course, moving into some sort of semi-regulated or contractually regulated market setup. But that's one way to deal with this. Another one would be for the buyer to declare some caps and floors to limit the sort of the potential participation, but then also limit the potential gain for those aiming for INCTEC strategies. If you have an organized market in place, the marketplace can set up market participation rules in which specific types of behavior or strategies are banned. The power exchanges, they have quite good experience with market monitoring, and some of the remit cases we have seen lately, they have arisen because of market monitoring activities. So these are some of the mitigating measures, and they are not really theoretical. They are applied on a day-to-day basis already. So this Norwegian example, is, there we are. The Norwegian example has its own name. It's called selling the same water day after day, or selling the same water twice. So producers within a bidding zone who knows that their production must be within a certain range in order to avoid some sort of internal grid constraints within the bidding zone, they may consider selling too much in the day-ahead market, offer a low price for downward regulation, and repeat that game day after day. But of course, if the producer can forecast this, rest assured that the TSO is also able to forecast this behavior. And after all, this is not really rocket science for the producer, neither for the TSO. And hence we have had for decades a special rule in the Norwegian regulation giving the TSO the authority to suspend the bids, and simply you take the offered volume, and instead of using the offered price, reward with the day-ahead price instead, or claim that the producer had to buy back at the day-ahead price. So in essence, to me, I wonder if we have essentially two discussions. At the transmission level, I agree with Leon that there are quite large problems, in particular when we have forecastable congestions. to me, that's a matter of what's the size of the bidding zone. At the distribution level, there is only one way forward, as in my opinion, and that is to activate the demand side via markets. So I think we should focus much harder on how to enable and extend market-based redispatch. We need to develop further those mitigating measures, and quite a lot of them are actually not that difficult to implement. We can also implement some of them without any regulatory measures. So there are no sort of large obstacles of implementing them. There is also, we also have to consider what is really the alternative to have a market-based redispatch, in particular at distribution level. How can we otherwise use demand-side flexibility if we cannot use it by markets? I don't really see any practical options to do that. And with that, I think the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jorgen, for this intervention. Also, lots of food for thought for the panel discussion, which is coming up. I was looking through the Slido questions. I think we can say recycle some of these questions for the panel discussion. Maybe before we move to the panel, at least I spotted one which was specifically directed to Leon, and that's one from Rikard Nielsen. So the question reads, Dr. Eers, I follow your academic logic, but is it not the size of the needed redispatch counter trading depending on the geographical delimitation of free day-ahead intraday markets versus, oh, I missed the question. It's moved up. Where is it gone? Sorry. I think someone voted it and then disappeared. There it is, sorry. Depending on the geographical limitation of free day-ahead intraday markets versus redispatch counter trading balancing?
Yes, so to give a short answer, the answer is yes. The whole problem that I've pointed out is we have two markets and they have a different geographic granularity. One zonal market and one nodal market, which we call spot and redispatch market, but the names, of course, in the end don't matter. That's the root of the problem, yes.
Thank you very much, Leon. Then I suggest we move to the 4 panelists. By the way, Jorgen, you are also happy to join and to turn your camera on. We would first start with some initial statements. And I would start, at least the first one on my list is Philippe Vasilopoulos. He's a director of product development at EPEX Spot. And before joining EPEX Spot, Philippe was an associate director of IHS CERA. He specializes in the European wholesale power and gas markets, and his expertise includes market design, price formation, price modeling, asset valuation, and due diligence, regulation, and market surveillance. He has carried out research on price signals and investment incentives in the European market for the French regulator, and he holds a master degree and a PhD from the University of Paris-Dauphine. So yeah, Philippe, thank you. If you can start with your 2-3 minute statements, and then we'll let the other panelists also comment. You're on mute. Or we can't hear you at least. Nope. Can you unmute yourself? I can try. You can hear something now. Can you unmute?
Now I think you should be able to hear me.
Yes, we can.
Sometimes technology can be tricky. Thanks. So what I was saying is, Marco, thanks a lot for this introduction. And I would also like to thank ENTSO E for addressing this topic on flexibility markets or market-based redispatch, which is really a key one for the future, as was shown by previous speakers on the size of the congestion. The point I wanted to make is going to be specific to index gaming and this and the impact it has on market flexibility, on flexibility markets. The first point I want to make is, first of all, we do recognize that index gaming is an issue, and certainly it's one that has been not well, but certainly documented for almost 3 decades. Well, at least 2 decades, not more, because I remember discussions on California or the PJM regarding index gaming, a presentation by Benjamin Hobbs, for example, showing this impact and how detrimental it can be to zonal markets. I would tend to say that, and this is going to be my message today, is that yes, it is an important topic, but no, we cannot ignore markets and we cannot undermine their role in developing flexibility going forward, especially when it has to do with tackling the energy transition, which is our objective altogether as a system or as a community, as a market. The few points I wanted to take, and I'll be very brief, are that, well, first of all, I would like to thank Leon for this elegant model to show how index can impact local flexibility markets, create more congestions, and aggravate welfare. I would tend to say that a few of these assumptions are quite theoretic, to say the least. For example, the fact that there is perfect foresight, the risk aversion of players, all this remains very far from reality, although index and gamings are very practical questions. Indeed, they're not a theoretic question, but very much a practical question. The point where I certainly disagree the most is when we say this is perfectly rational or this is just a simple arbitrage. No, it's not actually. Somebody's cheating there, and they're cheating because they're underbidding or overbidding. So this is, and I'm quoting also Leon, who said it's at some point he mentioned capacity withholding, and capacity withholding is punished. It's one of the most significant cases of market manipulation that we know, and again, this is also well documented for several decades. So if it is capacity withholding, then it should be punished. It should not be a reason to say markets should be left on the side and don't have a role to play there. We should try and address it. So that's the first point I have. The second one is that it is not shown how it applies to DSO grids or how it applies to loads. And I think it is a very important part of the discussion because this is the challenge that we're facing in Europe with intermittent renewable generation that is located on the distribution grid. So one of the challenges we have is going to be congestion management on the distribution grid. And I'm not convinced yet that it applies to the similar way as it is on the transmission network. So I think this is something that we certainly should analyze further going forward, and asserting that it has the same impact is just not good at this stage. The other point I wanted to make, and I think again this is another important one, is that we don't need more market power. I would be very much in line with the previous presentation that if there is market power, then of course this can be a lot more detrimental to the efficiency of the welfare. However, the fact that it is if you have competitive flexibility markets, you are seeing a lot lower revenues for the flexibility providers who are index gaming the system, and ultimately the risk profile that this participant will have will totally change. So we cannot consider that unless we take a very strong assumption on risk aversion, we cannot consider that having more competition is not going to reduce the incentives to index the system. So overall, and then I will finish with these few sentences, I think that in order to limit the impact, the negative impact that index gaming can have on flexibility markets, we should set up the right mitigation tools. But first and foremost, we need to promote desirable attributes in the market design. For example, the fact that it should be transparent, it should be competitive, it should be simple, and it should be robust. One example of this would be the long-term reservation of flexibility, which decreases significantly the incentives for gaming. And these are design elements that need to be onboarded in the flexibility markets. The second point is that enhanced market monitoring is done by not one party, but many parties, including national regulators, including competition authorities, including the exchanges, as was reminded, the TSOs. So it's not just one monitoring, it's many parties that are monitoring this. And of course, this has to go along with penalties and sanctions on the gaming behavior, which serves the same purpose as I mentioned previously, which is to make the strategy a very risky one. If the strategy is very risky, of course, it feeds into the cost-benefit analysis that the trader will do, and will not be carried out if the risks are higher than the advantages that come along with that. And with that, I'm done with the few words I wanted to say, and we can take this in the quick question and answers.
Thanks a lot, Philippe. I guess, Leon, you want to react at least to the first point about the assumptions, and then we can move to Susanna after that.
Would be happy to do so. I mean, there's a few points where I think I should quickly comment. But first and most important, if I understand everyone correctly, there seems to be consensus about the transmission grid. The fact that this redispatch markets is something we should discuss regarding distribution, but we should disregard regarding transmission. If that's indeed where we are, I think we've done a huge step forward in terms of understanding and converging relative to a few years ago. Second, yes, deck gaming is an old topic. The term has been coined around 2000 in California because there the redispatch market had the name increase-decrease market. So that's where the name comes from. So is it cheating? No, I think it's not cheating. I deliberately put capacity withholding in quotes, as you've seen on the slides. So withholding capacity on the redispatch market is the same as withholding capacity in order to provide balancing services, say FCR, and that's obviously not capacity withholding in the sense of reducing market power. I want to repeat because it's such an important point. In our model, all and every single generator at every moment in time behaved perfectly as a price taker. There wasn't any abuse of any market power. And we all know that capacity withholding to inflate prices can only work if you possess market power. That's not the case in our example, and nor in the other examples in the literature. We all agree that we can't perfectly predict anything, but I never claimed that's necessary. I didn't include imperfect forecast in the graphical model in order to make this to be able to convey this in 10 minutes. But of course, some reasonable, accurate prediction is sufficient to engage in this game. You will never be right always, but you will be right in often enough to make money. And today there's plenty of papers that show, public academic papers that show forecasting congestion, forecasting redispatch. It can be accurately done pretty easily using statistical methods, using load flow models, using machine learning. So there's whole dissertations being written and published on that topic. So anyone who has concerns about the predictability, I would be happy to offer our consulting services or to point to the public papers in order if you want to look at them themselves. And to give a last and very practical example, I mean, don't we all agree? If you own a coal plant in northern Germany, it's windy out there, you're going to know you're going to be redispatched downwards. Like, I don't even need to install any machine learning on any computer. I don't even need to have a computer. It's probably sufficient to open the windows.
Thank you, Leon. I would like to give the floor now to Susanna. Susanna Sadlova, she works for the regulatory department of the CES Group in Prague, and she focuses on European and Czech legislation related to electricity market functioning, such as network codes. She has worked previously for the energy section of the Ministry of Industry and Trade in the Czech Republic, and today she's representing Eurelectric.
Thanks a lot, Marco. First of all, thank you very much for invitation to this panel, which is really important. And well, I will try to be brief just to fit in time. And I would like to react on what has been said by Leon, but also by Jürgen. And well, I have to say I don't really share some concerns that have been raised about index gaming, especially because I kind of think that situation in each member state is unique. And it's true that in Germany, there are reoccurring congestions which are easily to predict, but that may not be the case in each and every member state. And this is something that we need to take into account when designing, rules and measures on the European level. That basically, and with this, I was quite surprised by the suggestion that we should automatically somehow ban market-based redispatch for the transmission grid, because it may be so easy to predict. But it really, really depends on the situation. At the same time, we in Euroelectric, we really believe that market-based measures are probably the most efficient solution to tackle congestion issues in the grid. It may be also the most efficient solution to tackle even the capacity allocation issues. So somehow to compare the value of basically the electricity trade and then the value of, limiting the grid and operating the grid. But I would like to return to market-based redispatch, and the question that remains unanswered in many, many countries, and we just shared it with our members, is basically, what is a market-based redispatch? Because that's something that's not really defined in the legislation, and it's really understood differently. So is it something which is contract-based? So there is like one contract between the generator and the market party, or is it marketplace? And obviously, if you have a small country with few generators in the transmission grid, and it's more than an issue of a remuneration, it makes some sense to go with a semi-regulated approach, because then indeed it would be difficult to set the price right. But this is, I would say this is like an open discussion, and it really differs country per country. And from our point of view, like existence of gaming, and it was correctly said that we already have, measures to tackle it, such as, the remit regulation, basically. Like market manipulation is very clearly described there. So the existence of gaming is not automatically a cause to somehow, forbid or abandon market-based approach. And it's especially very important to unlock flexibility in the distribution grids. And I will be really short to allow for discussion, which I'm looking forward, and I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susanna, for your very clear and also brief intervention. Would like now to move to Gerard, Gerard Dorman. He has long experience since the early day of the power markets, from power companies, consultancy, research, university teaching, and he's currently with the Norwegian TSO Statnett. He is an expert of market design with a focus on congestion management, balancing flexibility, capacity markets, and offshore. And today he's representing ENTSO E, where he has led the work on 2030 market design. Maybe before you start, just looked at a question from the audience from a colleague at TSO, a bit provocative. Maybe it can inspire your reply as well. So Kalle Cook is asking, if in-deck costs are still less than green investment, then what's the issue?
Thank you, Marco. Quite a challenging task to kind of tell what ENTSO E thinks about this subject, because I think there are many opinions within ENTSO E. Of course, we have had a discussion. I think we have very different solutions also from the different countries, and I think Susanna is quite right that the problem is not the same everywhere, and you can have local solutions that work some places but not other places. Otherwise, there seems to be in this forum a kind of I haven't heard what Mathieu thinks, but some kind of agreement that in distribution grids market-based solutions could be more favorable, not at least to attract the flexibility we need. And once you get large scale, many small contributions, you would also have much more competition, which I agree with Leon does not completely remove the problem, but at least reduces the economic downside of it, because so many will compete and try to get this price that in the end you get a pretty efficient solution, although it's not perfect. And that is also, I think, another conclusion. There is no perfect solution. There is no silver bullet. Somehow we have to muddle through. Apart from that, I think I tend to agree with Leon that in the transmission grid, this is a real issue, at least in many countries. And interestingly, the American discussion was already referred a couple of times before. This was a very hard discussion in the US, well, about 20 years ago, around the California crisis, and also afterwards. People like Bill Hogan, Ross Baldick, Frank Woloch, etc., wrote a lot about this and pretty clearly concluded the strong downside of these games. Maybe also a bit, maybe this is even worse in the US with the kind of behavior that is in the US and is expected and accepted, but still. Interestingly, the US jurisdictions drew their clear conclusions about what was the right market design. But of course, also here we have different opinions. Yeah, so there's no clear what is best. I tend to agree most with Leon, but on the other hand, also with Jürgen, that there are measures to cope with some of the problems at least, and especially what you mentioned in the Norwegian example, Jürgen, where you, for down regulation, you pay the day ahead market price, so there is nothing to earn. In our case, this is only applied during special conditions when there is temporary or long-term outages. However, I know I had some exchange with Miguel Martinez from REE in Spain, who was also in the meeting, I think, and who told me that in Spain this is the normal regulation. So for down regulation, at least the first after the day ahead market, they have this rule that you can you only pay the DA price, so there's no money to make on this kind of down regulation at least. So just some comments. Yeah, and there was this question about in-depth gaming. Yeah, of course, there is a cost and a benefit, and you could look at it that way, but you still have the sorry? Oh, no, it was some.
No, go on. I think maybe someone has.
This was my last remark. You still have the risk that also Leon mentioned, that you actually incentivize investments just to make money on the game. So if it's fine today, in the longer term you can risk and to get real bad problems in the longer term. So that's my comments.
Thank you very much, Gerard. Now moving to the last panelist, Mathieu Franzen. He's been active in the European electricity market since 2007 and has worked on a wide range of topics from market integration, market coupling, flow-based capacity calculation, and balancing markets. He is with Acer since 2020, and from July this year, he leads the market codes team within the electricity department. The team is responsible for all decision and recommendations related to CACM, FCA, and EB regulation. Mathieu, do you want to comment and maybe also elaborate on the monitoring issue, which has been raised by several ones before?
Indeed. Yes, thank you, Marco. Thank you for the invitation, and happy to discuss indeed this topic, which is, as you can imagine, also keeping us busy in a lot of different aspects. Maybe before I go into the Redispatch discussion, I would like to zoom out a bit, because also listening to the session before, I see that well, basically, I think the general understanding is indeed flexibility to be a need in the market for supply meeting demand and vice versa, and markets being the mechanisms to accommodate supply and demand meeting this via exchanges, via long-term markets, and that the improvement of those markets are a very important aspect of getting there. And I think sometimes it's good to repeat the obvious, but I hope we all agree that indeed improving those markets is very important, getting them more shorter term, more reflecting supply and demand, everything we've been working on in these years. What I'm a bit surprised about also seeing this morning is that how quickly the term flexibility quickly moves, almost between two slides, from meaning the above, so supply and demand, to meaning well, the need of TSOs and DSOs to manage congestions in their grid. And indeed, sometimes even managing future investments in the grid, indeed for the market meeting supply and demand. This shows me, and I think that this is part of also our internal discussion, this shows that the term flexibility is maybe the core of the problem sometimes. I personally don't really like it because of this mix of understanding, because indeed different perspectives lead to different understanding, and people can seem to agree with each other, but actually talk about different things. So I think we need to be aware of that and make sure that we have a good understanding. There's differences in how to regulate that as well. And then indeed a little bit the pink elephant in the room. Indeed, how does this need and indeed the benefit for society for managing congestions, how does it compare to the need and the benefits for society of supply meeting demand? I think I know the answer. Markets are well contributing a much more to societal benefits than but they need the grid. So one doesn't go without the other, but indeed having functioning markets is indeed the primary objectives. So indeed investments in the grid are, and in my view, also the main primary long-term solutions to make that happen. In Dutch, we say, we have a little bit of a funny thing saying koper is goedkoper, which means copper is cheaper. Most investments in electricity grid are a no-regret option. They need to happen. Especially if you look at the energy coming and becoming electric, this is definitely something that needs to happen. But indeed, also more wider system integration, also other energy carriers, of course, being important. But then, indeed, getting to the redispatch topic, of course, congestion on the short term can happen and indeed needs to be solved. Otherwise, people are stuck with having nothing because the grid collapsed or got disconnected. So indeed, solving congestions with I call it ex post congestion management, solving it when you know that it's coming, but doing that incidental, I think is a given, and of course also a very important signal of where investments are needed. But if you then I get also to Leon's presentation, which I think is really to the point of what happens if something becomes predictable and or structural, as we call it. It would indeed affect market functioning, would affect bidding, and we should really focus and rely on the ex ante congestion management. So cross-border capacity allocation, but there's also definitely other solutions to do solving congestion ex ante before they happen. I think the downward redispatch was mentioned. It's not really redispatch, but it's just preventing congestion from happening. This indeed could be a way of looking at it, which indeed has a lot less downsides than the ex ante market, especially if they are predictable. Then, and I think that's sort of maybe the starting statement. I think the balance between the solutions. I think we need to sort of keep the focus on on the bigger picture, so to say. Maybe then on market monitoring, I will be a bit safe on that. It's not my primary task within Acer. Of course, we have the task of doing market monitoring, and we will of course develop this where it is necessary. But looking at my own task in more in the market design, we need to find a proper market design solution before, and not say we know it's not a good market design solution, and we will depend on ex post oversight. That is, I think, not a proper regulatory solution. Of course, it's both. So we need to find a proper market design solution, and this could indeed come with ex post oversight. But if we take a solution which we already now know will be hugely problematic, I also looked at the Netflix documentary on Enron. I think we need to be very careful to move in that direction. So maybe that as a first statement. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Mathieu, and thank you, Jorgen, for waiting patiently. You're the only one who hasn't yet reacted, at least within this panel. Would you like to comment some of the previous statements?
Yeah, perhaps a brief comment that well, I think we agree, Leon, that on a transmission level, we cannot really ignore the IncTech potential. But whether the solution is market or is regulated redispatch or something else, I guess we are not fully agreed on, because I would rather have market-based redispatch and smaller bidding zones than the status quo. Because it is this thing about predictability that should not be as straightforward. We should organize the market such that it isn't that easy to cheat. Thanks.
Thank you, Jorgen. We are running out of time. If it was for me, I would stay much longer, but maybe let's take just 5 minutes more from the lunch break, if people can stay. Looking at the questions, well, at least I think we need to take the one which got most like from Paul Gisbert. It's more of a comment than a question and has been touched upon earlier, but Paul says the IncTech game is likely to constitute a remit violation, so it's illegal. And I think in another comment further down, yeah, he said balancing market is not part of the wholesale market. Sorry, is part of the wholesale market. So withholding capacity from day ahead to offer balancing is not a remit violation. I don't know if someone wants to react to these statements from Paul.
I think I might be able. I think I agree with Paul on the last statement. Indeed, the IncTech gaming in between Redispatch and day ahead market is indeed a bit more difficult due to if you create both markets, they are both regulated, and then indeed I think Leon put it quite to the point. Yeah, if it's rational behavior to arbitrate between those markets and you let them, and regulation doesn't forbid you. But I do see the downside of it, and we do look into this indeed.
Leon or anyone else wants to comment, or otherwise I can take another question.
I'm not enough of a law expert to have a clear opinion on this.
Okay,
I've heard different statements here. So some lawyers were very convinced that I talked to that indeed it is. Others were very convinced it's not. So it doesn't, to me as a lay person, it doesn't seem to be settled by courts or legal experts.
Thank you, Leon. Maybe I'll take another one, which another question was directed to you, Leon, but anyone else can also comment. Have you studied the use of long duration energy storage as flexibility provider, and could storage be remunerated under a regulatory basis, e.g. LNG terminals?
I'm going to be quick here. So I never look at individual technologies and think about market design for specific technologies, because I think pretty much every sensible market design on Earth must be technology neutral. I've looked into, and often capacity longer term contracts are difficult because in particular flexibility resources we want to dispatch are based on the real time, short term need of the system and the markets. So any longer term contract is difficult, as we all know from the capacity mechanism discussion. But we did look into the possibility of having longer term contracts, in particular for redispatch services. So the idea would be for the TSO to offer, or the DSO to offer a contract and say, for 1 year, I can regulate up or can regulate down up to X times, 100 times per year. And when I do so, you get the wholesale price as an energy price, or you pay depending on the direction. On top of this, I give you an annual premium, an annual price as a participation incentive. So I think that's something that might work, but it's not easy either. So it's not a silver bullet, but it might be one of the muddling through the puzzle pieces that we are all searching for. You hear my cautiousness, I hope.
Thank you very much. Anyone else wants to comment on this question?
Maybe just very briefly, that's basically, yeah, long-term contracts. It obviously depends on what long-term is. I guess not more than 1 year is something that could indeed solve some redispatch issues. And well, it's already the case today. You know, in most member states, you basically have redispatch contracts because you need them, and you have exactly these conditions stated. I wouldn't really agree on, you know, getting the market price plus some premium, because usually you need to have your costs covered. And now I mean, you know, cost including some opportunity costs. So you are not in, you know, loss when the, you know, market price is too low, spot market price is too low. But yeah, this could be a solution for not, I wouldn't say certain technologies, but just to make sure that, you know, the TSOs and DSOs have these resources there when needed.
Thank you, Sudana. I think the 5 minutes are over now, so I'm gonna need to close the panel, and thank you all very much for your participation. It's been a fascinating debate, maybe just a drop in the ocean of this interesting debate. Certainly not the first one or the last one, but I hope we've come to some interesting and constructive takeaways that we can take to continue forward, trying to find solutions for electricity market design of 2030 and beyond. So thank you very much again, all the speakers and panelists. We'll now break for lunch, and we resume at 1 o'clock sharp.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Sånn. Nå er jeg ferdig med min presentasjon. Ja.
Good afternoon, everybody. I would propose that we kick off with the third session of today, which is focused on enabling consumers' flexibility. And actually, given the discussion we had this morning, it really adds to the debate for me, because we have talked a lot about consumer and demand-side participation in different flexibility markets. And I think today we can discuss two case studies of KBC and Tibber on how they believe consumer participation can be enabled. I don't know, Freddie, whether you're already in the call.
I am.
Okay, thanks. Then let me take the opportunity to introduce you. So Freddie van Boegel holds a master in law and is a business banker and a financial specialist. He's innovation manager at KBC, which is a major European bank, active in 6 countries and has over 12 million customers. He describes himself as an energy transition evangelist. He is active in several energy ecosystems and he's really fond of co-creation. Finally, he refers to himself as a constructive critical thinker. So, Freddie, I'm more than happy to have you on board here to share your thoughts on how we can enable consumer flexibility.
Okay, thank you very much. I will share my screen if that's okay with you.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, indeed, I want to share some fundamental thoughts on enabling customers' flexibility, and in the end of my presentation, I will share an experiment with you, which we are doing right now as we speak. So, of course, I'm the odd one out here, and probably you ask yourself, what is a banker doing here? Originally, I'm a corporate banker. Since 2012, I'm involved in innovation within the KBC Group, what means that I'm in search for new and relevant and sustainable areas of activity for a financial services company in the 21st century. And we do this by actively looking for important societal transition waves. In this case, the energy transition. And our innovation center is called the Surf Studio, which means that we want to surf on important societal waves because we can't create them ourselves, of course, and we don't want to do that neither. And in concrete terms, this means that we need to become familiar with and explore the relevant ecosystem. And we want to know what is at stake, who the stakeholders are, what their interests are, what the problems are, the desired sustainability directions, the legal issues, and so on and so on. And of course, the opportunities and the threats involved. And when we are familiar with all that, or becoming more familiar with all that, we can think about solutions and about contributions we can deliver in order to reach the goals. And we cannot do this alone, and more about that in a moment. So it's a fascinating world for me, as well as for you, I guess. And of course, once a banker, always a banker, let's say. And one of the things that is very clear that in a distributed energy world, to get there, it means huge investments to be made by households, businesses, and also governments. And we are talking about a lot of money. And when I say a lot of money, I really mean a huge lot of money. The European Commission has calculated that the average EU member state will need to invest 2.5% of the gross domestic product every year in order to get where we want to get in 2050. So every year. And it's easier said than done, of course. And to put that in a perspective, the city of Leuven calculated that for this city of 110,000 inhabitants, they need to invest each year 350 million euro, 30 years in a row. And as a banker, you could say, okay, let's look at the bankability of all this and of this story and make sure that we are ready to fund the game. But we decided to take our time and go exploring in the energy system. And what were the main lessons we learned? And in my humble opinion, there are a number of important basic principles at play here, which are often forgotten in discussions about the transition. They get lost in technical and regulatory issues, and it's not uncommon to lose sight of the fundamental goals. And as a relative outsider, I can permit myself to recap these basis principles here. And one of the first and perhaps the most important basic principle is that it's all about sustainable value creation. And in a transactive energy system, value should be the common language to combine economic and control techniques and to align value streams for all parties by incenting actively managed systems that they can align their behavior with the needs of the rest of the system. And value is not only a monetary thing expressed in euros, because money is not the only value creator. We are talking about reliability, for instance, or flexibility. We are talking about bringing contributions to low emission, or it can also mean consist of scalability. And every objective and every constraint in a system can be described as a yield or a cost. And achieving an objective is a yield, of course, and addressing a constraint possibly has a cost. And the yields and the costs should be fairly distributed as well. And this morning we talked about gaming on markets and things like that. Also in the financial sector, it's a common thing, and it's sometimes disturbing, of course. But my sincere opinion and conviction is that when behavior is not creating value, well, it should not be rewarded by the market design neither. So sustainable value creation is all about economic value signals that could get captured in order to address multiple and concurrent objectives. And that's not an easy task to do. But when we want to end up with our goals achieved, we should do it either way. So what we need is, of course, dynamic pricing, because we see dynamic pricing as a holistic value signal that reflects the conditions of the energy system. And dynamic price is the ultimate incentive mechanism, because it's a way of influencing the owner of a flexible asset. And in this part of our webinar, we are talking about consumers, of course, to make some of all the flexibility available in that asset to improve efficiency, reliability, resilience of the system. And of course, all of this should be fully automated. Of course, within the comfort settings and needs of the asset owner, but you need to be served to manage the flexibility towards value creation without being busy with it, because you will not do it. And that's the second point in my reasoning here with you, that we are, of course, excited about all this, because and speaking for myself, I know a little, so I'm excited and even perhaps passionate. But our customer, the end consumer we are talking about right now, he's not excited at all. Perhaps he's excited about his energy bill, that's possible. But for the average customer, be it a household or a business, even a corporate, the entry barriers to the distributed system or the flexibility aspects of it are far too high. Let's not forget, it's all a very, very complex environment. Customers, they really lack knowledge and expertise. They lack scale. They have no possibilities to start to act in a relevant way. We should always remember that. And let me present a sporty challenge here. When you reread the clean energy package with the eyes of a customer, then and try to imagine that you should take some decision reading all this. And the reality is that there are thousands of pages of great strategic importance here, but most people don't even know it exists. So please also note that customers do not have a primary goal in the energy business. And for them, it's energy is like breathing. You have to breathe as a human being, and you want to do it, but you don't want to be constantly busy with how should I do it, how often should I do it, what does it cost, what are the consequences of doing this or that. And this brings me somehow seamlessly to what I would describe as the business case devil. We often think that financial profit is a goal of the energy transition. It may sound utopian, but I think higher profits don't seem to be the immediate goal of the energy transition. And what we see is that participation in the system often gives not a substantial financial incentive to parties to participate, especially for those who are not in the energy business as a primary goal. And with the far from substantial financial benefits to encourage them, they are not ready to make important intellectual or financial efforts. And we learned that it's hard to achieve a solid business case on the lowest level of the distributed energy system. For example, the incentives that can be scored in the area of flexibility by a household. And the conclusion is that it's much ado about nothing. And even perhaps that the game ain't worth the candle. But the question remains, is monetary value, called a business case, the only possible creator of value in this matter? And the question is, how do we motivate the customer, the end customer, the consumer we have in mind? The first thing is we need to offer him effortless participation, in which he has to invest minimally. Not financially, but also, and perhaps in the first place, also not intellectually, because it's too difficult. We need to relieve him in an extreme way of the complexity, even the disinformation. We need to make sure that we take the burden off of him. And we need to ensure that we remain in an energy as a service environment, because we are there now. And there is often said we need to go to energy as a service. No, I say we need to stay in energy as a service. And to think that all users, all end consumers become specialists who will create an operationally reliable, affordable and sustainable system all by themselves, individually or collectively with communities and things like that, it's really taking things too far, in my opinion. So, in order to get there, there is a lot of real co-creation needed. It was also mentioned in the morning sessions, because there is no party that can cope with all the aspects. So there are no silver bullets. We need to get together in order to develop system-wide benefits, of course, as opposed to sometimes to the maximization of the result of individual actors. So, with all this in mind, the Belgian TSO and DSOs have set up the Internet of Energy community to enable this co-creation. And we as KBC, we seized this opportunity and formed a consortium to apply the principles to an EV charging case. And we called it without that much, let's say, inspiration, EV experience, because we want to bring a good charging experience to the end customer, because we all know lots of people are confronted with range anxiety and things like that. So what we want to do is the following. First of all, an extremely low effort for the customer. As a matter of fact, no effort at all. Concrete. We provide in a plug-in charge solution. And one of the basic principles is that the driver will, or the car is always connected when not driving. And so a demand response solution by dynamic price signaling is coming to the possibility. And it's cost efficient for all parties. And I will focus on that one. We are building right now a solution based on a distributed ledger technology, or blockchain if you want, where all the small transactions that are involved now and in the future will be totally automated in a smart contract environment. So for the customer, it means I don't lose any comfort. And the solution itself is, of course, value-based with a lean back office for all parties involved. It's open source and co-creation first. We think that with the growing EV fleet in mind, we need to introduce this type of reasoning in order to deploy this EV fleet into the energy transition, and also, of course, as a very important source of flexibility. We will present a proof of concept at the end of December 21, and unfortunately, it's not possible for me to disclose all details, because we first want to be at the end of our exercise before communicating about it in detail. But it's good to know that the proposition is built around the concept of exchange of energy blocks of our TSO. It's published in a June 21 white paper, and the link in the presentation will lead you to that document. But in one sentence, it ends up this way. The use of this concept implies that the cost of a charging session will be presented automatically without any human intervention whatsoever, automatically to the party that should pay for it. For instance, the employer of the driver that occasionally uses a friend's charging pole during a visit. Things like that, where a lot of parties are involved and a lot of operational and administrative workload is created. So I think I'm within the time limits, and of course, very happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Freddie. I think there is one question or one remark which might be interesting to have your views as well. It basically states that we should clarify what we mean by flexibility for consumers as well, if we want to increase their participation. Do you agree with that? That we should
Yeah, I think that's a good remark, because it was stated this morning as well. Flexibility is has various meanings, and in my opinion, here it's purely demand response. So what we need to do is we will need to motivate our customer, our end user, to connect his car to the grid while not driving. And from that moment on, our promise to him is we will serve you within your comfort needs and limits at a price which is the best for you. And you can achieve this by acting system friendly. And system friendliness is demand response, in my opinion. And that's everything we need to tell him, and he will feel the consequences of his system-friendly behavior, because for him, that equals affordability. It's the same. It's let's say the two sides of the same reality.
Okay. Thank you. I propose that we shift to our second use case, but first we can more than happily integrate your thoughts in the panel debate just after. So I would like to introduce Jacob Dalton. He has a background in sustainability and energy engineering. After writing his master thesis for Tibber on the aggregation of electrical vehicles for use in ancillary services, he actually started to work for Tibber to turn this theory into a reality, and they have since commercialized the technology, and now he leads the trading and home energy management team. So welcome, Jacob.
Hi, thank you. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Fabulous.
We can't see yourself though.
I do have the video. You can share your video when you're done screen sharing. Fabulous teams. Apparently I can't share my video at the same time as sharing my screen.
Okay, sorry for that.
Yep, we'll have to live with that one. Sure. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks, Freddie, for that presentation. We have some synergies here. You'll hear some buzzwords and concepts that you've touched on there. So let's dive into it. Agenda, our transition challenges, a quick introduction to Tibber, and then diving into residential demand flexibility, how we untap it and how we currently deliver it.
Sorry to interrupt, Jakob. Otherwise, I can project the slides and you turn on your camera if you prefer.
Sure. Okay. I'll just have to tell you to change quite often, but that's fine.
Okay.
You can present then.
Share my screen.
Yeah. Teams, not so used to using it, but it seems to be the preferred TSO.
In any case, for certain features, we find it easy, but maybe not the most sophisticated. Okay, so this is slide one.
Sure, thanks. Great. If you jump to the next one. Right, Freddie touched on complexity there. So it's an incredibly complex market, and it's only increasing. And the complexity has so far been hidden behind a black box of the retailer or the supplier, and that's even further alienated the customer. Then there's volatility. Don't need to touch too much on COVID and the current crisis. Is it the new norm? And then the engineering challenge of the transformation. And if we go to the next one, there's the classic 3Ds that you've all heard of. And yeah, introducing Tibber a bit more, we embody all these three. So we are only selling sustainable energy. We're untapping the decentralized assets, and then also it's all come to fruition through digitization. But we add a fourth D there, if you go to the next one, of democratization. So again, touching on what Freddie had mentioned, we're actually looking to empower the end user to play an active role in this transition. If we go to the next, then I will quickly introduce Tibber as the digital energy company. The next slide. And when I say digital, I mean a full digital experience. So Freddie touched on the prices. Dynamic prices are exposed to our end users. So we pass on the spot price, which users can see live. And yeah, full digital experience to the point of digital. So no paper bills that you're getting once a month, but instead you see your real-time consumption if you have the required hardware that we develop also, or you see consumption 3 days later once we get it from the Dsos. And so it's actively engaging customers to change their behavior or suit their behavior to fit into this transition. So the home screen on the left there, thanks. Home screen on the left there is showing things like price or some different devices, production. There's the analysis page in the center, so you can go into detail of what has been consumed most, so disaggregation and also when. And then finally, there's a short example of the smart charging service, so our customers can set the desired time of departure, and we, according to the price signal, which is the spot price, minimize the cost of charging. If we continue, then yes, complexity and the attempt to simplify it. The next slide. Yeah, we can jump straight into the next. Here's a concrete example of some of the factors that Tibber optimizes, from the size of the main fuse, weather, power prices on a local DSO and also spot level, and then some concrete examples of the scheduling we can carry out, the EV, the battery, and the heating, for example. So here's just a concrete picture of the complexity that we have to deal with on a home level. And as, again, Freddie touched on, this cannot be exposed to our end users. There's no way that they need to be worrying about, this is just a fraction of the complexity, in fact, and it's a simplified picture. So this is what we need to handle and take care of for our end users, and that is touching on then energy as a service. And we're taking care of this complexity and exposing just a simple app to our end user. But the challenge comes with, this is on a local level, on a home level, I mean, then how do we bring those objectives up to the Tibber portfolio level, and what the global objectives are for Tibber, and then one level up to the system level, and how do we balance all those different objectives across those three different levels? And one aspect that can help in balancing those objectives is demand flexibility. So if we continue there, we can then touch on how we untap it in the next slide. Yes, insert buzzword here. So one more click, you'll see then it's all of them, VPPs for virtual power plants, or distributed energy resources, or aggregated fleets, whatever you want to call it, or whatever the buzzword is that feels most relevant for you. That is essentially what we're capable of. So we can communicate with and control hundreds of thousands of distributed devices. We have 500,000 devices connected to the Tibber platform today, and soon that will be millions. So this presents itself as a portfolio of assets with various characteristics. But to the grid or the Tibber portfolio or the TSO, it's presented as a single resource. And the ultimate value for Tibber and our customers and society at large is when we can actually optimize that portfolio for different use cases using the different assets and their attributes simultaneously. And this is a key missing piece in the puzzle. We need to untap this if we're going to be successful. There are resources sitting in garages or in homes with enormous flexibility, and it is the most efficient solution that we can untap them. If we touch on the next few slides, there's an example of a Wi-Fi connected heater that we can control and schedule and offer services with. And then also 2 more devices in the next slide of a wall box and the vehicle, the electric vehicle, which we can also communicate directly with. Yeah, you can stay on the next one. Just as an example, again, a concrete example of the data we're sitting on. We have state of charge of arrival and time of arrival, so driving behavior essentially here. So this is just an example of the wealth of data we're sitting on that we can use to solve the complexity and that complex problem touched on earlier. Then in terms of actually delivering it in the next slide, yeah, being an engineer, the most creative way I could come up with to show us actually delivering something was with a good old-fashioned plot. And here you see us, in this case, yeah, delivering FCR-N. There's 2 FCRs in the Nordics. So the real frequency in blue, the moving or rolling average in red, and then our fleet power in green. So you can see us delivering relatively well in this specific use case to Svenska Kraftnät, the Swedish TSO, in the FCR market, exactly. Then the next slide, yeah, we can break down to where we deliver flexibility and how. So concretely, on the national level, there are the Nordic transmission system operators, so Statnett in Norway and Svenska Kraftnät in Sweden. We're pre-qualified to deliver FCR in Sweden, and we've also delivered MFR in Norway as part of using the new EDX ECP electronic activation system. Tibber is currently active in Sweden, Norway, and Germany, and soon launching in the Netherlands. So yeah, we look to continue the relationship with the European TSOs. In terms of the experience in the Nordics so far, it's been a challenge, of course. We don't always speak the same language. The TSOs, especially in the Nordics, are talking about hydro turbine blade efficiency, and we're talking about batteries on wheels, so not the same language at all. But it's pretty clear that everyone understands that it's only through collaboration and cooperation that we can actually succeed here. So hats off to the TSOs so far. They've been as progressive as they can be in bringing in new technologies and opening up the markets. There are still many challenges, of course, moving forward. And I can touch on those when we talk about the local aspect. And we have been active, and we're currently delivering in Stockholm and in the south of Norway through the Nodes marketplace. And there too have been many challenges related to non-automated processes and manual processes that perhaps a DSO is used to, but a fast-moving tech company like ourselves, we will draw the line if something is not scalable or is not possible to be automated. So as a concrete example, it's no problem to register 5 assets manually when you have huge industrial load or large production sites. But if you have 5,000 assets, we are not going to be doing that manually. And it's been a challenge communicating that to an actor like a DSO who doesn't see that perspective and who doesn't understand that our business case only succeeds when it's scalable, and that we can bring in automation and efficiency into our processes. So we will say no to anything that does not enable that. So here's a concrete barrier that we want to underline. And then, of course, there are the big challenges of, again, combining those 3 different layers and the complexity between them and the objectives between them, and how the clashes of those objectives are going to be managed between the local and the national level, for example. We also see the DSOs in Norway bringing in time of use tariffs and peak tariffs that are complex enough for us, too complex for us to understand, and yet alone the end user, and also start introducing clashing between the different signals, the spot prices or other flexibility markets. Then the last one I wanted to touch on in terms of a challenge is a concrete challenge we can imagine is the role of the independent aggregator. So Tibber is a BRP. We don't, in that sense, we're lucky that we don't have to, worry about having an agreement with other BRPs, but and we're all for having independent aggregators. But here's a concrete challenge I can imagine we know that will be faced is, for example, the accounting of the rebound effect. So if a independent aggregator was to deliver flexibility, that volume is accounted for in settlement, but on a demand side resource, that volume of energy doesn't disappear. It's just going to be pushed into future hours, and that can be called a rebound effect. And I don't think anyone has concretely spent enough time looking into how that's going to be handled or accounted for, and who's going to be responsible for paying for it, for example. So that's one that's coming up, another example that we see as a challenge. So those are two use cases for flexibility, national, local, and then finally there's the Tibber use case. So the portfolio optimization I touched on earlier. If we can bring down our cost, help the system, get paid for it, then we're also going to bring down our cost to serve our users, and therefore accelerate growth, and therefore have more users on our platform or on similar platforms that are actually changing the behavior and incentivized to help the transition, which is positive for society at large. So those are the three aspects where we can look to deliver flexibility. And yeah, there's challenges in balancing all the objectives across all the three of them and doing it in the most efficient way that actually benefits society. And in the end, like Freddie mentioned, what's the ultimate goal here? And it's clearly not just money. That's it on this slide. Finally, a shameless plug. We are growing. We have 250,000 users at the moment across the 3 markets, soon 4. So yeah, always open for bright minds who are up for a challenge to join our team. But that's it from our side. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe if we can have a short question from the chat. So, and maybe it's a common question to you and Freddie, Jacob, but basically somebody is not very convinced by the idea of having flexibility or actually using these kinds of flexibility on lower voltage level to support the system, because in the end, we're not talking specifically, if we talk about the energy challenge to TSO or DSO needs, but actually the flexibility of the system to cover the 60 gigawatt of change. And somebody is not convinced that in the end, consumers are going to contribute in such a significant way to the flexibility. So maybe a question from me to the 2 use cases. Have you seen these large volumes of flexibility being made available? And how do you estimate in a way that all these electrical vehicles can actually contribute to providing sufficient system flexibility, not DSO flexibility, but system flexibility to manage the significant shift we're expecting by 2030?
Well, I'm no engineer or technician, and so please forgive me if I'm talking nonsense, but for instance, our operational car lease company, KBC Autolease, has 50,000 cars in its portfolio. It seems that they will be electric within a few years. The pace is really increasing dramatically right now. So when these 50,000 cars, let's say with a battery of 60 kilowatt hours, this means 3 million kilowatt hours energy in those batteries. So this is the daily consumption of 300,000 households in that system. So I really can't imagine that this fleet, when properly addressed, could not play an important role in the distributed energy system of the future. When this should be the case, I think everything we are talking about here today is irrelevant. And this is a medium-sized leasing company. So when we really could end up with customers that are motivated to connect their cars at destination, of course. We are always talking about destination charging right now. When they arrive at home, they connect their cars and the system will deal with it within the comfort limits of the customer, but on a system-friendly basis. I think when we can achieve that, it is creating value for the system. And in the end, of course, for the users of the system. Perhaps I'm wrong because I'm no technician, but